It's 11 minutes past 8 and we have Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Good morning, Mick.
Now, of course, Creation Ministries International have their own website, creation.com, but we're answering questions that come in from our listeners, Dr. John, and we're also talking about news that came out in the last week or so, and the latest questions, which a couple of them have come in since last week, Dr. John. I'll read them out for you. One was, can you please explain the division between the devil and God on the earth and the roles they play? A lot of people always say, if your God is so good, why does he let horrible things happen? That's a good question.
It certainly is.
And another one that came in was, for Dr. John, we started with Adam and Eve and then only 8 remained with Noah's flood. Is evolution responsible as to why we have different looking races, i.e. Anglo-Saxon, Asian, Slavic, Mediterranean, Arabic, Aboriginal, African, Indian, South American, etc.? Another good question.
Another very good one.
And then finally, last week we had a question that we didn't have time to answer, and that was, if Jesus made up stories to teach the truth, should we not be open to the possibility that from this cultural background, the Adam and Eve story does not need to be scientific or historical to teach us the truth about our relationship to Uawe? Surely it's more of a spiritual journey than a scientific text.
Well, look, Mick, they are all great questions, and they're all questions that we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
This morning we'll probably mention a little bit about the one about the devil.
Mm-hmm.
The one about the races and evolution and so on, that's a very big topic on its own, and that's going to take a full morning to cover. Mm-hmm. But the really good one was that first one. Well, they're all good, but the first one was one that I wanted to cover this morning, and that is an excellent question, which is that Jesus spoke in parables because he wanted to use stories to illustrate spiritual truth. Mm-hmm. And is it possible that that's what the Adam and Eve story is, a story to illustrate spiritual truth rather than true history?
Yes.
Well, of course, there's no doubt that it does illustrate spiritual truth, but there are a number of reasons why it really has to be true history as well. And it not only that story about creation not only mentions the first 2 humans as Adam and Eve, but it also mentions their first 2 children, and it talks about Cain and Abel as well. Now, you can't just dismiss that as Old Testament mythology, because all of those 4, Adam, Eve, Cain and Abel, are all mentioned as real people in the New Testament.
Yes.
So you can't get away with saying that they can't be historical figures.
Yep.
Now, the other thing that we read in the early chapters of Genesis is the list of those early descendants of Adam.
Yep.
And it lists them by name.
Yes.
And it tells you how old each one was when he died and how old each one was at the birth of his best-known son. Mm-hmm. And when you add up all of those ages, what you find out is that the earth is only very, very young. It's only a matter of thousands of years old, and it's not a matter of millions and billions of years old as the world would have you believe. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole lot of reasons why that can't be just Old Testament mythology and can't be just a parable. And I'm going to deal with a few of those this morning.
Absolutely. And of course, Jesus taught from the Old Testament, and a lot of those facts in Genesis, if you took the facts away, they're not really something that would make up part of a parable. They are something that makes up a part of the real creation story. But they don't need to be there if it was a parable, if you get my meaning.
Yeah, well, really, the other point, Mick, is that you can't really understand the gospel if they're only a parable. They have to be real history, and that's something that we're going to deal with this morning.
Absolutely. You're on 94.9 this morning. It is 8:15. And Dr. John's here from Creation Ministries International answering your questions. Simply send them through to our text line, and that text line number is 0401 949 949. We've got Dr. John in the studio from Creation Ministries International, and Dr. John's been talking to us this morning about a question that came in last week, And the question was to do with the Old Testament and whether, Jesus was teaching in parables when he was talking about that, or the first few books in the Bible, or whether it's actual history. Dr. John?
Yes. Well, Mick, there's no doubt that the story about Adam and Eve does convey spiritual truth, no doubt about that. But there are plenty of reasons why it has to be true history. And there's one very important one that I want to talk about this morning. Mm-hmm. The gospel absolutely depends on its being true history. Mm-hmm. Because there's a concept that the Old Testament introduces, the concept of what they call a kinsman redeemer, where a close relative of a person who may have fallen on hard times or something like that, mm-hmm. has got a responsibility under Jewish law to look after them financially and maybe have to pay a price, maybe cover their debt or something like that. Mm-hmm. And the book of Ruth is the classic book in the Old Testament that talks about that, where Boaz was the closest relative of Ruth's deceased husband. And so he then took her as wife and took financial responsibility for her. And of course, they both then appear in the genealogy of Jesus. Mm-hmm. But that's this concept of kinsman redeemer. Now, Jesus himself is referred to as our redeemer. He was the one who had to pay a price to get humanity back into relationship with God. Now, even though Jesus himself was part of the Trinitarian Godhead, he was God the Son, he had to be born into the earth as a man so he could be a genuine descendant of Adam. Mm-hmm. Very interesting concept, this. Adam, one man, squandered the dominion that he had in the earth, and a man who was a descendant of Adam had to get it back. And that's why we read Jesus' genealogy in the New Testament. When we get to Luke chapter 3, we see Jesus' genealogy, and it goes back, first of all, to David, to prove that he genuinely was the King of the Jews. God had promised that a descendant of David was going to be on the throne of Israel forever. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus had to be a descendant of David. He then takes his genealogy back to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob to demonstrate that he was a true Israelite, one of God's chosen people. Mm-hmm. And then he takes the genealogy right back to Adam, so that Jesus could function as our kinsman redeemer, a relative who could then pay a price for us. Now, the next question you might ask is, why did anybody have to pay a price for us? And this is where it becomes a little bit theological. We do know that Satan and the demonic forces had control of the earth and all its inhabitants. We know that because when Jesus went up on the mountain to be tempted, or out into the wilderness to be tempted, Satan came to him and he said that the world had been given to him and he had the right to give it to anyone he chose. Mm-hmm. Now, Jesus didn't correct him because he knew it was true.
That part was true, yes.
That's right. The Bible tells us that the whole world lies in the power of the wicked one. And, we've just sung that in one of the Christmas carols, O Holy Night. Long lay the world in sin and error pining. We've been singing that over the last few weeks. Now, we don't fully understand how all of this works spiritually, but what we do know is that Jesus got mankind's authority back from the devil. Mm-hmm. Humanity lost its spiritual authority when Adam relinquished it, and Jesus got it back. And that's why we can read at the end of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus could say that all authority now in heaven and earth had been given to him. Mm-hmm. And we know too that the Apostle John tells us that the Son of God, that is Jesus, appeared for this primary purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. So for all of these reasons, it's absolutely essential that the creation and fall story is true history. And it's not just a parable illustrating spiritual truth. Mm-hmm. So really that's one of the very, very main reasons. But there is another one, the aspect of immortality. Now, when you think about it, according to the Bible, death was not part of that original creation. It only came in with the sin of Adam and Eve. And that sin corrupted the entire cosmos, including the earth. Now, the point of Jesus' resurrection is that immortality is going to return to a new heavens and a new earth that are going to be newly created. And there'll be no place in that new creation for any corrupting influence. Satan and his demonic forces are going to end up in the lake of fire, as the book of Revelation tells us.
Absolutely. We're with Dr. John this morning from Creation Ministries International. He's answering your questions. By the way, there was one more that came through just then, Dr. John. In terms of the age of the world, is it not possible that Adam and Eve were in the garden for millennia before the fall? I've always wondered about that.
No, I don't think it's possible. And a quick answer to that is because Seth was born well after Cain murdered Abel, and that was only 130 years after Adam, and Adam was 130 years old then. So no, I don't believe they could have been in the garden for millennia.
There we go. We're with Dr. John. We'll be back after the news, weather and traffic. But right now, we've got a line. You're on 94.9 this morning. And we're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, who's answering your questions. Simply send them through to our text line, 0401 949 949. Now, may I also mention right now that if you ever miss Dr. John, we now have a podcast for Dr. John on our website. Go to rema.cc and you can just click on the podcasts button, and at the bottom of the page there, you'll see creation questions. And we've got quite a few on there now. There's about 3 pages of different... They're on YouTube, but they're audio clips of the last few, quite a few, creation question times. So that's awesome, Dr. John. Great to see them there.
It is, Mick. It's great. And can I just say before we go on, what a wonderful psalm that Psalm 91 is. One of my favourite psalms. It really is a fantastic encouragement and an assurance of where we stand with God and the protection that he offers. So it really is great. But look, we were talking about why the Adam and Eve story has to be true history. Mm-hmm. And I just briefly mentioned before the news that one of the real issues why it has to be true history is this issue of immortality. Yep. Because we read that there was no death before the original sin of Adam and Eve, and that immortality is going to be restored. And we are going to get a new nature that's not going to be subject to sin like our old nature is. And I mean, everybody really ought to be rejoicing in that. You know, we all look at it, ourselves, and we see the corruption that's there deep within. And won't it be wonderful to have a new nature where you don't have that corruption? I think that's fantastic. Mm. Now, in a sense, we're already that new creation, but we do have to pass through death to get fully rid of that old nature. Of course, some are going to escape that transition through death. You know, we read in 1 Thessalonians how the believers who are alive at the time Jesus returns are going to be transformed without dying. You know, that's a wonderful thought as well.
I'd like to be one of those.
Oh, so would I. I mean, look, Mick, it's really exciting stuff. Who would want to miss out on what lies ahead? Mm. And you can understand the passion of the Apostle Paul. You know, he on all these travels, he went into the synagogues and he pleaded with the Jews to believe him that Jesus really was their long-awaited and promised Messiah. But he had great difficulty trying to convince them. Mm. But I mean, ultimately, that's why we do what we do at Creation Ministries, because it is vitally important for everyone on earth to submit to the lordship of Jesus. Mm. And this fabricated idea of evolution and long ages is a major stumbling block to people coming to believe in Jesus. Now, our mission is to get rid of the stumbling block by showing how the real scientific evidence matches up with what the Bible describes, and that evolution does not match up with what the Bible describes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we're constantly pointing out articles in the science news and showing how the evidence that the scientists themselves are discovering actually shows that their belief in evolution is inconsistent with the facts that they are discovering, inconsistent with that evidence.
Absolutely, and this is where the crocodiles or alligators come in?
Oh, yeah, that was another one. I mean, there was a story about how the scientists in the States, they dumped 3 weighted alligator carcasses in the Gulf of Mexico,
mm-hmm.
and that let them sink to the bottom and put cameras down there to see what happened.
Yeah, obviously to see them turn into fossils.
Yeah, absolutely. Supposedly they were going to get covered in sediment, and they put alligators down there because they've got very tough skin, as you know, and they didn't think it'd be easy for them to get scavenged. But they surely did.
Yes.
Bones and all. There was even a worm that chewed up the bones of these alligators. So they didn't get fossilised. And, I mean, this is one of the problems that we have. People have been convinced, and they read it in their science textbooks, of this diagram of the fossil record, you know,
mm-hmm.
with the supposed early creatures at the bottom and building up to later creatures near the top. And supposedly you've got this order of sediments where there's an order of fossils that demonstrates evolution.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, you don't find that in reality. You can't find anywhere in the world where that order of fossils exists like that.
Yep.
And I think I probably mentioned when I went to Coober Pedy last year and talked to the miners over there, when they sink their shafts down there looking for the opals, what they find is the fossils are the same all the way down. You know, you don't
all
find
mixed up. They're not in order.
You don't find that nice, neat order that you see in the textbooks. It's just an artist's make-believe. And fossilisation really is an extremely rare event. We don't see it happening these days.
No. I've actually had people ask me before, they talk about fossils, and I say, yeah, well, how could that happen if there wasn't like a giant flood with masses of sediment? And they go, oh, what if there was like a rockfall or, you know, a bit of sand sort of, you know, just falling down onto them like a little rockfall under the ocean, that type of thing. But you don't find fossils, you know, just in these weird-shaped rocks that would end up in, you know, from a rockfall. You find them on big, flat, sedimentary platforms with lots of sediment until the next layer. So it doesn't typically look like a little rockfall fell on them.
Yeah, well, you certainly can't say that the same sort of little rockfall has happened in hundreds of thousands of similar places all over the world, because that's what would have to happen, because all over the world we find the same picture of these fossils in the various layers of sediment. So logically you would have to postulate that a global event was responsible for it.
Yeah.
And when we look at what some of those fossils are like, we see that many of them have clearly been buried alive unexpectedly, obviously by a truckload of sediment that's come in like an avalanche in a great flood. That's the obvious scenario.
With a huge layer above to the next sort
Absolutely.
of... Yeah.
And, you know, before Darwin, that's what the world generally believed. They generally believed that the fossils that they were discovering, and they were only being discovered probably for about 50 years before Darwin anyway, it was generally believed that it was Noah's flood that had done it. And it was only after Darwin that it came to be believed as the order of evolution like we now see in the textbooks.
Yeah. You're on 94.9 this morning with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. And from Creation Ministries International, he's in the studio answering your questions. Simply send them through to 0401 949 949. That is our text line. Now, Dr. John, we've been talking this morning about the way Jesus told stories in parables, and whether maybe the Genesis story was really just a parable, and you've pretty much debunked that already, Dr. John, but I believe right now you're going to tie it into a story about a dinosaur that was found in the last week. We saw the news about a dinosaur found in Winton, Queensland.
Yes, well, that's right, Mick. And as you know, one of the other reasons why we believe that the world is only thousands of years old is because we know that that Adam and Eve story is true history. It's not just a way of spiritualising beliefs. Mm-hmm. And I've talked about a few of the reasons this morning why we believe that it has to be true history, because the gospel is dependent on it. But there we had that story of the theropod dinosaur out there in outback Queensland, and how he's 95 million years old.
Yes.
And I'm going to talk one morning about how a lot of these dates are derived. But I just mentioned before the last break that it doesn't matter what the evidence that the scientists find, even though it's contrary to their evolutionary belief, somehow or other it gets shoehorned in. Mm-hmm. Because the millions and billions of years is an absolute sacred cow. Mm. Nothing can be done to rock that boat. And there have been so many discoveries about dinosaur fossils, like how they've had proteins in them, and connective tissue, and blood vessels, and red blood cells, and things like that. Things that the scientists absolutely know could not possibly last millions of years, and yet they somehow try to shoehorn that into the belief, because one of the things that you cannot go back on is the fact that there have got to be these millions and billions of years, because evolution depends on it, and of course evolution is the only way that you can get God out of the picture.
Yeah.
But look, even things like radioactive carbon has been detected in dinosaur bones, and that means it's scientifically impossible for those bones to be millions of years old. And they have to either ignore these findings or sweep them under the carpet.
In fact, it's scientifically impossible for them to even be hundreds of thousands of years old.
That's right, because the maximum time limit for radioactive carbon is about 60 to 80,000 years, even if those years existed, which we don't believe that they do. So look, really I think we can say that nothing is going to rock the evolutionary boat. It doesn't matter what the discoveries are. But what we say at Creation Ministries is when you fit those new discoveries into the biblical framework, you find that it always matches up. So there is just no problem with all these new discoveries that are coming out. And look, Christians can be absolutely confident that the Bible is accurate in its past history. And just as it's accurate in its past history, it's also true in its future history. You know, Jesus will return, and those who've put their faith and trust in him will be saved, and they will enjoy a glorious future in the world to come. And I think that is just so exciting to look forward to. You know, you wouldn't want to miss out, would you? Mm-hmm. So really, anybody who hasn't turned to the Lord Jesus Christ and his lordship over their life is really going to miss out on the most exciting, time, I suppose you'd say, in future history. The Apostle Paul says that no eye has seen or ear heard, or it hasn't even entered into the heart of man what God has got in store for those who love him. And I can't wait. I think it's going to be fantastic.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you, Dr. John. Another awesome week. We do answer questions that come in from you onto our text line 0401 949. Keep them coming during the week. I can send them through to Dr. John. Now, Dr. John, can we have a little peek at what's going to happen next week? Do you know what we're speaking about next week?
Well, the first one that we had about the races, really. You read it out.
Yep.
About how we started off with Adam and Eve, and then it was condensed to just the 8 survivors of the flood.
Yep.
But now we have all of these different races throughout the world. And we're going to talk next week about how we really did get all of those races, and it's not evolution.
Yes, absolutely. Alrighty, well, that sounds exciting for next week. That'll be next Tuesday morning around 8. Now, if you have missed any of the creation sessions and you'd like to see them, of course, jump onto rema.cc and click on podcasts. Today's podcast will be on there in the next couple of days. Maybe you've got some friends that you'd like to send them to. Just send them a link to the podcast. You were on 94.9 this morning. Thank you, Dr. John.
Thank you, Mick. It's been great to be here again this morning.
And we'll